The lantern's flame flickered against the rough-hewn walls of the Brimstone cabin, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits across the pine-planked floor. Elias Brimstone hunched over the scarred oak table, his calloused hands steady as he sharpened his hunting knife with deliberate strokes. At 42, he was a man built from the Kentucky hills themselves, broad-shouldered, with a beard streaked gray from years under the sun and a gaze that missed nothing in the dim light. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and simmering stew, the kind that stuck to your ribs against the autumn chill seeping through the chinks in the logs. Beside him, his wife, Clara, stirred the iron pot over the hearth, her movements precise and unhurried. She was smaller than Elias, wiry from mending fences and birthing 7 children, though only 3 remained under their roof now. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, and her eyes, sharp as flint, flicked toward the window where the forest pressed close, leaves rustling like whispers. "Storm's brewin'," she said, not looking up. "Heard thunder rollin' in from the ridge." Elias grunted, testing the blade's edge with his thumb.
"Aye.
Best get the barn doors latched before it hits." Their eldest son, Jonah, 16 and already towering over his father, pushed through the door then, shaking rain from his coat like a dog. Water dripped from the brim of his hat, pooling on the threshold. He carried a burlap sack slung over one shoulder, heavy with the day's trap, rabbits and a brace of squirrels, their fur matted and still. "Found these snares intact," Jonah reported, dumping the sack by the table. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a boy-turning man under the weight of expectation. He wiped his hands on his trousers, glancing at his younger sister, Lila, who sat cross-legged by the fire, mending a tear in her apron with needle and thread. At 12, she was all quiet curiosity, her freckled face framed by braids that caught the firelight. Clara nodded approval at the hall.
Good.
"We'll need the meat if travelers come knockin' again." The Brimstone's cabin sat on a lonely trail off the wilderness road, a spot where wanderers from the east often sought shelter. Last week, a pair of peddlers had arrived soaked and weary, sharing tales of Louisville markets before bedding down in the loft. They'd left at dawn, faces blank as fresh slate, waving vague goodbyes without a word of their night. Elias had found their wagon untouched, goods intact, but something in their eyes had lingered in his mind, like fog that wouldn't lift. As the first fat drops pattered against the roof, a distant rumble echoed through the valley. Jonah crossed to the window, peering into the gathering dusk. "Pa, you reckon those miners from the coal camps'll pass this way? Heard talk in town of a vein runnin' dry up north." Elias sheathed the knife. "Maybe. But if they do, we keep to the code, shelter, food, no questions." He rose, clapping Jonah on the shoulder, the gesture firm but brief. The boy nodded, but his eyes lingered on the treeline, where branches swayed like beckoning fingers. Lila set her sewing aside, her small voice cutting the quiet. "What if they forget, like the others? Ma, why do they look so lost when they go?" Clara paused in her stirring, the ladle hovering, but she only smiled faintly, turning back to the pot. "Folks carry their own burdens, child. Best not to pry." The storm broke then, wind howling as if the hills themselves were grieving. Elias and Jonah stepped out to secure the animals, the door banging shut behind them. Inside, Clara ladled stew into bowls, the steam rising like ghosts from the grave. Lila watched the flames, unaware of the faint, acrid scent threading through the smoke. Brimstone, sharp and unnatural, carried on the gale from the shadowed ridge beyond. Elias Brimstone wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, the late afternoon sun slanting through the parlor windows like shafts of molten gold. The air hung heavy with the scent of polished oak and the faint, underlying tang of something sharper. Brimstone, his mother always called it, though it was just the sulfur from the creek beds nearby. He glanced at the mantel clock, its hands creeping toward 5. The guests would arrive soon, and with them, the weight of expectation that made his stomach twist. His sister, Clara, bustled in from the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour. At 16, She carried herself with the quiet determination of someone who'd long since learned to shoulder secrets. "Elias, have you checked the cellar?" Pa said the jars need sealing. Her voice was low, urgent, as if the walls themselves might eavesdrop. He nodded, pushing himself up from the armchair. "Already did. They're set." But as he moved toward the door, a flicker of unease stirred in his chest. Last time, with the Thompsons from Lexington, something had gone wrong. A jar cracked in the night, and the dreams that followed. He shook it off. No use dwelling. The family had done this for generations, welcoming travelers along the old post road, offering rest and refreshment. And in the morning, they left lighter, unburdened by whatever troubles clung to them like shadows. Outside, the gravel crunched under his boots as he crossed the yard to the barn. The Kentucky hills rolled out in waves of green, dotted with blackberry thickets and the occasional hickory tree, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Thunder rumbled distantly, a promise of rain that would turn the roads to mud. Elias paused at the barn door, listening. Inside, the horses stamped softly, but there was another sound, a low, rhythmic scraping, like claws on wood. He swung the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Dim light filtered through cracks in the siding, illuminating the stalls. Old Bess, the mare, eyed him warily, her flanks heaving. But it was the far corner that drew his gaze, the locked chest, its iron bands gleaming faintly. The scraping came from there, insistent, like a heartbeat muffled by layers of earth. "Elias." Clara's voice called from the house, sharp enough to cut through the haze. He blinked, stepping back. Just the wind, he told himself. Or rats. The chest had been quiet for weeks. By the time he returned to the parlor, the first wagon was visible on the horizon, a dust cloud trailing behind it like a weary ghost. Pa emerged from his study, his face etched with the lines of too many unspoken burdens. Tall and broad-shouldered, Amos Brimstone moved with the deliberate grace of a man who knew the land's hidden rhythms. "Two couples from the looks of it," he said, peering out the window. "City folk, probably headed to Louisville. We'll give 'em the East Room and the stew." Clara set the table, her hands steady despite the tremor Elias noticed in her fingers. She caught his eye and mouthed, "Be careful." He forced a smile, but the scraping echoed in his mind, a thread pulling tighter. As the wagon pulled up, the travelers dismounted wearily, Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove, prosperous merchants by their fine wool coats, and the younger pair, the Langleys, with the fresh-faced look of newlyweds. Greetings were exchanged, hands shaken, and invitations extended with the warmth of old hospitality. But as they stepped inside, Elias saw it, the subtle shift in Mrs. Hargrove's eyes, a glaze of fatigue that went deeper than the road's toll. She clutched a locket at her throat, her knuckles white. Dinner unfolded with practiced ease. Stories flowed, tales of market dealings and riverboats, while the stew steamed on the plates, rich with venison and herbs from the garden. Amos poured cider from the jug, its contents dark and spiced. Clara watched from the sideboard, her wits surfacing in light jests that eased the newcomer's stiffness. "Traveling lightens the soul," she said to young Mr. Langley, who laughed and raised his glass. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling. Under the table, his boot nudged the loose floorboard, where the trapdoor to the cellar lay hidden. The jars waited below, each one etched with runes from Pa's old books, ready to capture what the night would bring. Dreams, memories, the burdens guests carried unwittingly. That's what they took, leaving folks refreshed, though none ever recalled the stay. As the meal wound down, thunder cracked closer, rain pattering against the roof. The Hargroves retired first, Mrs. Hargrove murmuring thanks before vanishing upstairs. The Langleys lingered, sharing a quiet moment by the fire. Elias cleared the plates, his ears straining for any sound from the barn. Nothing. Yet. That night, as the house settled into silence, Elias lay awake in his attic room, the wind howling through the eaves. Footsteps creaked below, Pa making his rounds. Then a sharper noise, a gasp, muffled, from the east room. He bolted upright, heart pounding. Slipping from bed, he crept down the stairs, the lantern's glow casting long shadows. In the hallway, Clara waited, her nightdress pale in the dim light. "It's starting," she whispered. "The locket." She wouldn't let it go. Elias followed her gaze to the door, where a faint, acrid smoke seeped from beneath.
"Brimstone."
The air thickened with it, and from within, a voice murmured, Mrs. Hargrove's, but altered, pleading words that twisted into something ancient, unrecognizable. Pa Elias Brimstone wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, the lantern's flicker casting long shadows across the barn's weathered beams. The air hung heavy with the scent of hay and damp earth, but tonight it carried something sharper, smoke from the chimney back at the house, where supper had long since cooled. He glanced toward the open door, where the Kentucky hills rolled dark under a moonless sky, and listened for the clip of boots on the path. The guests had been restless all evening, their laughter from the parlor fading into murmurs that set his teeth on edge. Inside the house, Miriam moved like a shadow through the kitchen, her skirts whispering against the floorboards. She paused at the window, peering out at the stable where Elias tended the horses. The two travelers, Mr. Harlan from Louisville, with his broad shoulders and easy grin, and his sister Eliza, sharp-eyed and quick with questions, had accepted their hospitality without suspicion. But Miriam knew the signs, the way Harlan's gaze lingered on the family Bible on the mantel, or how Eliza toyed with her locket, as if weighing secrets of her own. She turned back to the hearth, stirring the embers with a poker, her fingers steady despite the chill that no fire could touch. Lila sat at the edge of her bed upstairs, the quilt pulled tight around her shoulders. The room smelled of lavender from the sachet under her pillow, but it did little to mask the faint, metallic tang that always crept in after dark. She could hear her parents below, their voices low and measured, discussing the route the guests would take come morning. Harlan had spoken of business in the tobacco fields, Eliza of kin further south, but Lila wondered if they sensed the weight in the air, the way the walls seemed to lean in listening. She slipped to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass, and watched a bat flit past, its wings a silent blur against the night. Elias stepped into the yard, the gravel crunching under his boots, and made for the house. The lantern swung in his grip, painting the ground in swaying gold. He thought of the cellar door, bolted tight beneath the stairs, and the jars lined up in the dim light, clear liquid that shimmered like dew but held no reflection. Harlan had asked about the family's trade earlier, over plates of cornbread and venison, and Elias had spun a tale of distilling fine whiskey from the creek water. It bought time, but not trust. As he reached the porch, the door creaked open, and there stood Eliza, her shawl draped loose, eyes wide in the lantern's glow. "Couldn't sleep?" Elias asked, his voice rough from the day's labor, keeping it light as he set the lantern on the rail. She nodded, stepping out into the cool air. "The wind carries strange sounds out here, like whispers in the trees." Her words hung between them, not quite an accusation, but probing enough to make Elias's pulse quicken. He forced a chuckle, gesturing toward the hills. "Just the owls, ma'am. They've got stories of their own, but nothing to fret over." He moved past her into the house, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and felt her gaze follow him like a draft down his spine. In the parlor, Harlan pored over a map spread across the table, the candlelight flickering across inked lines of rivers and roads. Miriam entered with a tray of tea, her smile warm but her eyes distant, as if seeing something beyond the room's confines. "Planning your path already?" she said, setting the cups down with a soft clink. Harlan looked up, folding the map with deliberate care. "Dawn comes early. Don't want to miss the ford before the rains swell it." He accepted the tea, sipping slowly, but his brow furrowed as he glanced toward the stairs. "Your daughter's a quiet one. Reminds me of my own back home. Always watching." Miriam's hand paused on the teapot. "Lila's got the hills in her blood. They teach caution." She turned away then, busying herself with the fire, but the room felt smaller, the shadows pooling thicker in the corners. Upstairs, Lila crept from her room, the hallway stretching long and narrow under the faint glow of a wall sconce. She paused at the guest's door, ear pressed to the wood, catching the rustle of sheets and a muffled sigh. What dreams haunted them here? She backed away, heart thudding, and slipped down the stairs, drawn by the murmur of voices below. At the landing, she saw her father speaking with Eliza on the porch, their silhouettes framed against the night, and something in the tilt of his head, too still, too listening, made her breath catch. The clock in the hall struck midnight, its chime echoing through the house like a warning. Elias ushered Eliza back inside, the door clicking shut behind them, sealing the world out. But as they moved toward the parlor, a faint scratching sounded from the cellar door, soft as nails on wood. Miriam froze, her hand on the banister, and met Elias's gaze across the room. Harlan straightened in his chair, ears pricked, but said nothing, his fingers tightening on the map's edge. Lila descended the last step, her bare feet silent on the rug, and joined her parents by the fire. The family exchanged no words, but the air thickened, charged with the unspoken. Eliza settled into a chair, rubbing her arms against the sudden chill, and Harlan poured more tea, his movements precise. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying echoes that might have been whispers, or something older, stirring in the dark earth beneath the house. Elias Brimstone wiped the sweat from his brow, the lantern's flame flickering against the damp stone walls of the cellar. The air down here hung heavy, thick with the scent of earth and something sharper, like singed wool. He'd come alone this time, leaving the women upstairs with their hushed prayers and the creak of floorboards underfoot. The guests, those poor souls from the traveling caravan, had been restless all evening, their eyes darting like cornered rabbits. But now, in the quiet hours past midnight, Elias needed answers, not excuses. He knelt by the wooden crate in the corner, its lid splintered from years of disuse. Inside lay the family Bible, its leather cover cracked and faded, pages yellowed like old teeth. Elias's fingers trembled as he turned to the marked passage, the one his grandfather had whispered about on his deathbed. "The mark comes with the fog," the old man had rasped, eyes wild. "It takes what it wants, leaves the rest hollow." Elias read the words again, the ink blurred but insistent, a warning of visitors who arrived under brimstone skies, bearing gifts that twisted the mind. A soft scrape echoed from the stairs, footsteps, light and hesitant. Elias snapped the book shut, shoving it back into the crate. "Who's there?" His voice came out rougher than intended, echoing off the low ceiling. "It's me, Pa." Mary's voice, small but steady, filtered down. She appeared at the bottom step, her nightgown pale in the lantern light, a shawl clutched around her shoulders. At 16, she was all sharp angles and quiet resolve, the cautious one who mended fences before they broke. "Heard you moving about." "Ma's asleep, but the doctor's stirring again. Says he saw lights in the woods." Elias stood, brushing dirt from his knees. The doctor, that city fellow with his fancy coat and pocket watch, had been the first to arrive 2 days back, half drowned from the river swell. Then the sisters, Eliza and Clara, with their wagon mired in the mud. All of them claiming the same, a sudden fog rolling in from the hills, thick as smoke from hell's own chimney. Elias had welcomed them, as any Christian would, but now doubt gnawed at him like a persistent ache. "Keep him abed," Elias said, taking the lantern. "I'll check the woods myself." He didn't wait for her protest, climbing the stairs with Mary close behind. The house above was still, save for the distant hoot of an owl. But as they reached the kitchen, a low murmur drifted from the parlor, voices, urgent and overlapping. Mary froze, her hand on Elias's arm. "That's the sisters. Arguing." They crept to the doorway. Eliza, the elder with her pinned-up hair coming loose, paced before the hearth, while Clara sat hunched on the settee, twisting a handkerchief. The fire had died to embers, casting long shadows that danced like specters. "Can't just leave it," Eliza was saying, her voice a whip crack in the quiet. "He took my locket, Clara. The one with Mother's picture. I woke up and it was gone, like it never was." Clara's face crumpled, tears streaking her cheeks. "Mine too." The letter from Thomas. I remember writing it, but now it's as if I never did. What if it's spreading? What if we forget each other next? Elias stepped in, the lantern swinging. Ladies, it's late for such talk. But his words faltered as Eliza whirled, her eyes wide, not with fear, but a fierce, unyielding clarity. She was the brave one. He'd noted from the start, the type to stare down a storm. You've seen it too, haven't you, Mr. Brimstone? Eliza demanded, stepping closer. The fog. It whispers. Last night, I heard my name called from the treeline, soft as a lover's breath. And this morning, the doctor's babbling about lost years, says he can't recall his own wife's face. Mary edged forward, her caution warring with concern. Pa, the Bible. Does it say anything about this? Elias hesitated, the weight of the cellar's secrets pressing on him. Upstairs, a floorboard groaned. The doctor, perhaps, rising unbidden. Outside, the wind kicked up, rattling the shutters like impatient fingers. He glanced at the window, where the first hints of dawn grayed the glass, but no fog yet. Not yet. Listen, Elias said finally, his voice low and steady. We face this together. No running, no forgetting. But first, we need to know what took those things. And why it's still here. Eliza nodded, wiping her hands on her skirt as if readying for battle. Clara rose, shaky but determined. Mary lit another candle, her movements precise. The four of them stood there, a fragile circle against the encroaching chill, as the first tendrils of mist began to curl against the panes. Elias Brimstone wiped the sweat from his brow with a sleeve already stained from the morning's labors. The sun hung low over the Kentucky hills, casting long shadows that clawed at the edges of the family's modest cabin like fingers testing for weakness. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, brimstone, his father always called it, though no one in the county mined sulfur anymore. Elias glanced at the mantel where the family Bible lay open, its pages yellowed and curling, as if the words themselves were trying to escape. His sister, Clara, knelt by the hearth, stirring a pot of stew that bubbled too slowly, the flames beneath it flickering as if reluctant to burn. She was the cautious one, always had been, her dark hair pinned back tightly, eyes darting to the door every few moments. "Pa's not back yet," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "And those guests, they were supposed to leave at dawn." Elias nodded, though unease twisted in his gut like a knife. The guests had arrived 2 nights prior, 3 travelers from the east, weary from the road, seeking shelter from a storm that had passed without a drop of rain. Mr. Hargrove, the tall one with the ledger and ink-stained fingers, his wife, pale and silent, and young Tommy, their boy, no older than 12, who had stared at the cabin's walls as if they whispered secrets. Pa had welcomed them with his usual gruff hospitality, but Elias had seen the way his father's eyes lingered, calculating. Now, the cabin felt emptier than it should. No clatter of pots from the guests, no child's laughter echoing off the rafters. Elias stepped to the window, peering out at the treeline where mist clung to the underbrush like a shroud. They must have gone already. Pa probably saw them off. Clara set the spoon down with a clink. Without saying goodbye, without their things, she rose, smoothing her apron, and joined him at the window. Her hand trembled slightly as she pointed to the yard. There, half buried in the mud, lay a single boot, Hargrove's, by the look of it, sturdy leather scuffed from travel. No sign of the man or the others. A chill slithered down Elias's spine, unrelated to the cooling evening air. He remembered the stories Pa told by firelight, tales of the hollows where folks wandered in and never wandered out, their memories stripped away like bark from a tree. Foolishness, he'd mutter, but his voice would drop low, and the fire would dim just a touch. Elias had always dismissed them as yarns to keep the young ones close. But now, with the silence pressing in, doubt gnawed at him. "Let's check the barn," Clara said, her voice steadying as she grabbed a lantern from the hook. Elias followed, his boots thudding against the floorboards that creaked like old bones. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like distant voices, murmuring complaints. The barn door hung ajar, swaying gently, and as they approached, a faint metallic tang hit the air. Blood or rust, Elias couldn't tell. Pushing the door open, the lantern's glow spilled across the straw-strewn floor. Empty stalls, tools leaning against the walls like forgotten sentinels. But in the far corner, something caught the light, a scrap of fabric, torn from a dress, snagged on a nail. Clara gasped, snatching it up. It was Mrs. Hargrove's, the blue calico she'd worn upon arrival. Elias, what if Pa... Don't! He cut her off, sharper than intended. But his mind raced. Pa had been different lately, his hands shaking when he thought no one watched, muttering about debts to the land, to the hollow itself. The Brimstone name wasn't just a family moniker. It was whispered in town as a curse, tied to old mining accidents where men emerged from the shafts blink-eyed, forgetting wives and children. A rustle from the loft above froze them both. Elias raised the lantern higher, heart pounding in his ears. Dust motes danced in the beam, and then a shape, small and huddled, dropped down with a soft thud. Tommy Hargrove, the boy, curled into a ball amid the hay, his eyes wide but vacant, like polished stones. He didn't cry out, didn't run. Just stared, unblinking, as if the world had been erased from his mind. Clara knelt beside him, whispering his name, but the boy only rocked slowly, humming a tune none of them recognized. Elias's throat tightened. This wasn't right. The hollow's pull, Pa had called it once, a dread that seeped into bones and stole what made a person whole. And now, with the guests vanishing one by one, Elias wondered if their own blood was next. From the treeline, a figure emerged, Pa, limping slightly, his coat muddied. He stopped at the barn door, his face shadowed, eyes gleaming with something feral. Get inside, he growled, voice rough as gravel. Before the mist takes you too. Elias Brimstone wiped the sweat from his brow, the lantern's flame flickering like a hesitant heartbeat in the dim cellar. The air down here clung to his skin, thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, sulfur, perhaps, or the faint rot of forgotten roots. He'd come alone this time, leaving Mary and the children upstairs with the guests, their voices a muffled murmur through the floorboards. The trapdoor had creaked shut behind him, sealing him in with the shadows that seemed to shift just beyond the light. He knelt by the wooden crate, its lid splintered from years of rough handling. Inside, the jars gleamed dully, each one etched with faint scratches that might have been letters in some old tongue. Elias's fingers trembled as he lifted one, the glass cool and unnaturally heavy. The liquid within swirled lazily, a pale amber that caught the light and twisted it into something sickly yellow. He remembered the night the first guest had arrived, feverish and rambling about debts unpaid, and how Pa had pressed a jar to the man's lips. By morning, the stranger had wandered off into the mist, his eyes vacant, his stories of pursuit forgotten like dreams upon waking. A soft scrape echoed from the far wall, pulling Elias upright. Rats, he told himself, or the house settling on its crooked foundation. But the sound came again, deliberate, like nails on stone. He swung the lantern higher, its beam carving through the gloom to reveal the rough-hewn wall, veined with cracks that wept tiny beads of moisture. Nothing moved, yet the air grew heavier, pressing against his chest, and he could almost hear it, a low hum, vibrating through the floor like the earth's own whisper. Elias set the jar down carefully, his mind racing back to the dinner table upstairs. The new guests, the Thompsons from over the ridge, had been wary at first, their daughter clutching a locket as if it held her soul. But the stew had warmed them, the stories had flowed, and now they laughed too easily, their questions about the family's isolation fading into complacency. Mary had shot him a look across the table, her eyes sharp as flint, warning him not to mention the cellar. "They're staying the night," she'd said later, when the Thompsons retired to the spare room. "But come morning, they'll leave lighter." The scrape returned, closer now, from the shadows behind the crates. Elias's heart thudded, a brave front cracking under the weight of isolation. He was no coward. Hadn't he faced down claim jumpers with a shotgun at 16? But this house, this legacy from Pa, nodded him differently. It promised prosperity, drawing wanderers with promises of shelter, only to strip them bare. He edged toward the sound, lantern raised, the light spilling over a loose stone in the wall. It protruded just enough to notice, as if inviting touch. With a steadying breath, he wedged his fingers into the gap and pulled. The stone gave way with a groan, revealing a hollow beyond, blacker than the cellar's depths, exhaling a chill that raised gooseflesh on his arms. From within drifted a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers on glass, insistent and unyielding. Elias leaned in, the lantern's glow barely penetrating, and for a moment he thought he saw eyes, pale, unblinking, staring back from the void. Footsteps thumped overhead, jolting him. Mary's voice called down, muffled but urgent. "Elias?" The girl's asking for her pa. Something's not right. He shoved the stone back into place, the scrape of rock on rock echoing his retreat. As he climbed the ladder, the cellar door banging shut behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lurked below had marked him now, its hunger seeping into the house like smoke through cracks. Upstairs, the guests stirred, their memories fraying at the edges, but Elias wondered if this time the cost would claim one of their own. Elias Brimstone wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, the lantern's flicker casting jagged shadows across the cellar walls. The air down here hung thick, like breathing through damp wool, and every creak from the house above set his teeth on edge. He'd come alone this time, leaving Clara and the boys upstairs to barricade the doors. The guests, those poor souls who'd arrived just days ago, full of city talk and easy laughter, were gone now, or so it seemed. But Elias knew better. He could feel it in the way the floorboards groaned, as if the house itself were holding its breath. He knelt by the old trunk, its iron bands rusted but unyielding, and pried at the latch with his knife. Inside lay the remnants, a silver locket, etched with initials he didn't recognize, a scrap of lace from a dress that smelled faintly of lavender, and something sharper, like charred wood. The family had found these after the first visitors vanished back in 52. Elias's father had called it a mercy, the way the fog rolled in from the hollow and stole their minds clean. No screams, no blood, just emptiness, and the guests wandering off into the mist like sleepwalkers, destined for roads they'd never remember taking. A soft scrape echoed from the far corner, pulling him upright. His heart hammered, but he didn't call out. Brave as he was, Elias had learned caution the hard way. Rushing in had cost his brother his life, or whatever passed for it after the hollow claimed him. He raised the lantern, its light slicing through the gloom to reveal nothing but stacked crates and cobwebs. Yet the scrape came again, closer, like nails on stone. He edged forward, boots silent on the packed earth, his free hand gripping the pistol tucked in his belt. Loaded with salt rounds, as his pa had taught. Useless against men, maybe, but this was a man. The sound stopped. Elias froze, listening to the drip of water somewhere unseen. Then, from behind a barrel, a shape stirred, small, huddled, not one of the adults. It was little Tommy Hargrove, one of the guests' boy, no more than Nate, his face pale as milk under a mop of dark hair. The child looked up, eyes wide but vacant, like polished glass. "Mr. Brimstone," he whispered, voice thin as a reed. "The whispers say you're next." Elias's stomach twisted. He shouldn't be here, not after the fog had lifted at dawn, taking the parents with it. The boy had been left behind, or so Clara thought, a sign of the Hollow's mercy, perhaps. But now, seeing those eyes, Elias knew it was a lure. He reached out slowly, whispering, "Come on, son. Let's get you upstairs. Safe with Mama." Tommy didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head, and the shadows in the corner seemed to deepen, coiling like smoke. They left without memories, the boy said, echoing the old rhyme his pa used to mutter in the fields. "But you'll leave with echoes." A low hum started then, vibrating through the floor, and Elias felt the first tug, not in his body, but in his mind, like fingers prying at the edges of a dream. He backed away, lanterns swinging wild, illuminating fleeting glimpses, hands, pale and elongated, reaching from the cracks in the walls. Not real, he told himself, but his caution screamed otherwise. The pistol came out, thumb cocking the hammer with a click that cut the hum short. Tommy, or whatever wore his skin, smiled, teeth too sharp in the lantern's glow. Elias fired, the salt bloom filling the air with acrid smoke. The shape shrieked, dissolving into wisps that reeked of brimstone, and the boy slumped, unharmed but still, breathing shallow. Elias scooped him up, heavy as sin, and bolted for the stairs. The cellar door slammed shut behind him, unbidden, but he shouldered through, emerging into the kitchen where Clara waited, her face drawn tight with worry. She was the witty one, always quick with a quip to cut the fear, but tonight her eyes held only steel. "What in the Lord's name was that?" she asked, taking the boy from his arms and laying him on the table. "Echoes," Elias muttered, reloading the pistol with shaking hands. "The hollow's testing us. That thing down there, it spoke through him." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint call of crows from the treeline. The Brimstone land had always bordered the hollow, that sunken stretch of earth where the maples twisted wrong and the ground never fully dried. Folks said it was a sinkhole from the war, or older, from the devil's own footsteps. But Elias knew it was hungrier than that, a maw that fed on recollections, leaving husks in its wake. Clara pressed a cloth to the boy's forehead, her movements precise despite the tremor in her voice. "We can't keep hiding. The others, the Millers, the Hargroves, they came for the harvest fair, thinking our farm a safe stop. Now their wagon's empty, and we've got their young un as proof." She glanced at Elias, her caution mirroring his own. "If we send him back, the hollow takes us all." He nodded, staring at the boy. Tommy stirred, murmuring something about a river that flowed backward. Upstairs, young Jed, their eldest, pounded down the steps, rifle in hand. At 16, he was brave to a fault, all fire and no sense. "Pa, it's out there again." The lights in the fog, dancing like fireflies but cold. Elias gripped his son's shoulder, feeling Elias Brimstone wipe the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, the lantern's flicker casting jagged shadows across the root cellar's damp walls. The air hung thick, laced with the earthy tang of potatoes and something sharper, like ozone before a storm. He'd come down here alone after supper, telling the others he needed to check the stores, but truth be told, he was hiding from the questions. From Abigail's piercing stare, from young Thomas's fidgeting, and worst of all, from the way the stranger upstairs seemed to watch them all, his eyes too bright, too knowing. The cellar steps creaked behind him, and Elias tensed, his fingers tightening around the shovel's handle. He wasn't one for confrontation, cautious by nature, always measuring risks like a merchant weighing grain, but lately, the house felt like it was closing in, secrets bubbling up from the floorboards. Footsteps descended, soft and deliberate. Not Abigail's brisk tread, nor Thomas's clumsy shuffle. It was her, the guest they'd taken in 3 days past, the one who'd washed up on their doorstep half delirious, muttering about lost kin and forgotten roads. "Mr. Brimstone," she said, her voice a low murmur that seemed to echo off the stone. She stopped at the bottom step, her silhouette framed by the faint light from above. Her dress, once fine calico, was muddied at the hem, and her hair fell loose, wild as the briars outside. "You can't keep avoiding us. The boy knows something's amiss." Elias turned slowly, forcing a steady gaze. She was right, of course. Thomas had been skittish all evening, picking at his cornbread, his wide eyes darting to the windows as if expecting ghosts to peer in. The family had always kept their peculiarities close, the whispers of brimstone in the well, the way certain nights left the air humming, but this woman, Clara was her name, had stirred it all up. She'd arrived with no memory of how she'd come to be on their land, and now, pieces of the puzzle were fraying at the edges. "I ain't avoiding nothing," Elias replied, leaning the shovel against a crate. His voice came out gruffer than intended, a shield against the unease gnawing at his gut. Just making sure we got enough for winter. Times are lean. Clara stepped closer, her boots scraping the dirt floor. In the lantern light, her face looked gaunt, shadows pooling under her cheekbones. Lean? That's what you call it? I saw the marks on the barn door this morning, scratches like claws, fresh as yesterday. And the way your wife looks at me, like I'm a thief in the night. Elias swallowed, the dryness in his throat betraying him. The scratches. He dismissed them to Abigail as raccoons, but they ran too deep, too deliberate, curving like the old symbols his grandfather had carved into the mantle to ward off. What? The family lore spoke of visitations, spirits tied to the land since the first Brimstones settled here, drawn by the sulfur springs that bubbled black and foul. Guests had come and gone over the years, leaving with hazy recollections, kinder for the forgetting. But Clara was different. She remembered too much, or perhaps not enough, and it was unraveling them. Upstairs, a door slammed. Thomas, probably, restless in his room. Elias glanced up, the sound pulling him back. The boy's just restless. Schooling him myself ain't easy. Clara's laugh was soft, bitter. Restless? He asked me today if I was one of them. The ones who come at night. She tilted her head, studying him. What are they, Elias? What haunts this place that makes folks leave empty-headed? He felt the air shift then, a subtle pressure building, like the moment before rain breaks. The lantern flame dipped, though no draft stirred the cellar. Elias's pulse quickened. He'd felt this before, as a boy, when the house seemed to breathe. You best go back up, he said, stepping toward the stairs. Ain't no place for a lady down here after dark. But she didn't move. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished locket, holding it out. This washed up with me, or so I thought. But it's yours, isn't it? Engraved with A.B. And inside. She flipped it open, the faint light catching the faded miniature of a woman, his mother long gone. Elias froze. That locket had vanished years ago, the night of the last visitation, when the air filled with whispers and the well ran dry. How had she found it? Or worse, how had it found her? The shadows in the corner seemed to lengthen, coiling like smoke, and for the first time, Elias wondered if the family's curse wasn't something they wielded, but something that wielded them. From above, Abigail's voice called down, sharp with worry. Elias? Thomas is gone, slipped out the back. The words hit like a slap. Elias bolted up the stairs, Clara close behind, the locket clutched in her fist. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, thick and unyielding, the distant howl of wind carrying something more, a low, rhythmic chant that set his teeth on edge. Thomas, out in the dark, toward the Brimstone well. The boy, brave in his curiosity, had always poked at forbidden things. Elias burst through the door, the cold air slapping his face, and ran into the yard, lanterns swinging wild. Clara followed, her breath ragged. We have to find him before they do. Elias nodded, no words left, as the first Elias gripped the lantern tighter, its flame flickering like a heartbeat in the dim cellar. The air down here hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, like singed cloth. He'd come alone this time, leaving the others upstairs to watch the doors, because the whispers from the walls had grown too insistent to ignore. They weren't words, not quite, just fragments of voices overlapping, pulling at the edges of his mind. He stepped over the scattered jars of preserves, their labels peeling like old skin, and pressed his ear to the rough stone. A low rumble echoed from the tunnel ahead, the one they'd uncovered last week under the floorboards. It wasn't the house settling. No, this was deeper, a vibration that climbed up his boots and into his chest. Elias swallowed, tasting dust, and shone the light into the blackness. The beam caught on something metallic, a glint, then a shape. Chains? No, links of some rusted contraption, half buried in the dirt. He knelt, fingers brushing the cold iron, and felt a jolt, not pain but a memory that wasn't his. Laughter in a parlor, glasses clinking, then silence falling like fog. Upstairs, Clara paced the kitchen, her skirts whispering against the floor. The clock on the mantel ticked louder than it should, each second a reminder that dawn was hours away. She'd sent Elias down there against her better judgment, but the guests, those pale strangers who'd arrived uninvited, had left traces everywhere. One of their hat boxes still sat unopened on the table, its lid askew, spilling out faded letters tied with ribbon. She picked one up, the paper brittle under her touch, and unfolded it. Words swam before her eyes. Remember the bargain, the memories we trade. Her hands trembled. What had the Brimstones promised in their haste for prosperity? The farm had thrived after those visits, crops bursting from the soil, but now the fields lay barren and the family's recollections frayed at the seams. A floorboard creaked overhead, and Clara froze. Not Elias, he'd gone below. She set the letter down and grabbed the poker from the hearth, its weight reassuring in her palm. The house felt alive tonight, walls breathing with secrets. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step groaning in protest, toward the guest room where the last visitor had vanished without a trace. The door hung ajar, and inside, the bed was made, sheets crisp as if no one had ever slept there. But on the pillow lay a single glove, embroidered with unfamiliar initials. E.B. Elias Brimstone? No, that couldn't be right. Her brother's name was etched in her mind, yet doubt wormed in, making her question the shape of his face. In the tunnel, Elias pushed forward, the lantern swinging wild shadows across the walls. The voices sharpened, forming pleas. Don't let them take it all. He recognized one timbre, his father's, long dead, or was he? The chain contraption led to a wooden panel, swollen with age. He pried it open with a grunt, revealing a chamber no bigger than a root cellar. Inside, shelves lined the walls, holding glass vials filled with swirling mists, memories, he realized with a chill, captured and stored like preserves. One vial glowed faintly, labeled in a spidery hand. The guest's arrival, 1857. His fingers itched to smash them, but a shadow shifted in the corner, and he spun, light catching eyes that gleamed too human in the dark. Clara reached the landing, poker raised, when a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. She twisted, elbow connecting with soft flesh, and the grip loosened. It was young Tommy, the farmhand they'd taken in last harvest, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "Miss Clara," he gasped, "they're comin' back." I saw, in the mist outside, figures without faces, reach in for the windows. She pulled him into the hallway, heart pounding. Tommy had always been the cautious one, eyes wide at every rustle in the corn, but now fear stripped him bare. "We can't wait for Elias," she said, voice steady despite the tremor. "The ledger in the study. Father's old one. It has the terms of whatever deal they made." Down below, Elias backed away from the shadow, which coalesced into a figure, a woman in outdated finery, her dress moth-eaten, eyes hollow as the vials. "You keep what you trade," she murmured, voice echoing the whispers. She wasn't solid, more vapor than flesh, but her hand extended, palm up, offering nothing but cold. Elias smashed the nearest shelf, vials shattering in a cascade of fog that clawed at his thoughts. Images flooded him. Banquets with the guests, toasts to forgotten packs, his family's laughter turning to blank stares as memories slipped away. He ran, the tunnel collapsing in his wake, stones tumbling like accusations. Clara and Tommy rifled through the study, dust motes dancing in the candlelight. The ledger was buried under ledgers of debts, its pages yellowed and cramped with ink. She traced the final entry. "For the land's bounty, we surrender the recollections of our kin. Guests depart whole, hosts forget." Tommy's breath hitched. "That means us, miss. We're the hosts now, and they're here to collect." A crash from the cellar shook the house, and Elias burst through the door, covered in grime, eyes wild. "It's them," he panted. "The guests, they never left. They're the house itself, feeding on what we gave." The three of them barricaded the doors as the mist seeped under the sills, carrying whispers that promised release if only they'd open their Elias shifted in the dim lantern light of the Brimstone parlor, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, like charred bone. His fingers trembled as he clutched the worn leather journal, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Outside, the Kentucky night pressed against the windows, a relentless drizzle turning the world into a blurred watercolor of grays. He glanced at Mary, her face pale and drawn, seated across from him on the threadbare settee. She hadn't spoken since they'd found the first body in the root cellar, not the guests, but old Mr. Harrows, the handyman who'd vanished weeks ago. His eyes stared up from the dirt, empty as forgotten wells, and no memory lingered in them, just like the others. The house creaked, a low groan that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the Brimstone place were breathing. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the storm's humidity. "We can't stay here," he whispered, though he knew it for a lie. The roads were mud-choked, and the nearest town was a day's ride on good footing. Mary's eyes met his, sharp with the caution she'd always carried, the trait that had kept her alive through fevers and floods. "And go where?" she replied, her voice steady but edged with fatigue. "They took the horses last night. And Thomas, he won't wake." Thomas lay upstairs, their youngest brother, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Whatever had seeped into the guests, those polite strangers from the riverboat, arrived with smiles and tales of Cincinnati, had touched him too. He'd been the one to welcome them, offering stew and shelter from the rain. Now, his gaze wandered vacant when it opened at all, memories stripped like bark from a tree. Elias flipped open the journal, his father's scrawled notes blurring under his gaze. Pa had written of the land's curse, the brimstone springs that bubbled under the hill, whispering promises to those who listened too long. "It takes what it needs," the last entry read, dated the night before Pa disappeared. Elias's hand tightened. Bravery had always been his mask, but tonight it cracked. A thud echoed from the kitchen, muffled but deliberate. Mary was on her feet in an instant, grabbing the iron poker from the hearth. Elias followed, heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The lantern swung in his grip, casting jagged shadows that danced across the floorboards. They crept down the hall, the house's timbers sighing underfoot. In the kitchen, the back door hung ajar, rainwater pooling on the threshold. And there, slumped against the wall, was the silhouette of one of the guests, Miss Eliza, the one with a laugh like wind chimes. But her eyes, they were wrong, glassy and unblinking, fixed on nothing. Elias froze, the journal slipping from his fingers to thump on the floor. Miss Eliza stirred, her head lolling as if on strings. She rose slowly, unnaturally smooth, her dress sodden and clinging like a second skin. "The spring's call," she murmured, her voice not her own, flat, echoing, laced with the sulfur tang that rose from the earth after rain. Mary's grip whitened on the poker. "Stay back," she warned, but Eliza, or what wore her shape, tilted its head, a smile cracking her lips without warmth. It stepped forward, and Elias saw the truth then. The veins under her skin pulsed faintly, glowing like embers in ash. He lunged, not with fists but with the lantern, swinging it high. Oil splashed, flame kissing the hem of Eliza's skirt. She didn't scream. Instead, a hiss escaped her, like steam from a kettle. The fire took hold quickly, fabric blooming into orange petals, and she staggered back toward the door, arms flailing in silence. Mary pulled Elias away as the figure collapsed into the mud outside, the rain hissing where it met the flames. They slammed the door shut, barring it with the heavy oak table, breaths ragged in the sudden quiet. But the quiet wasn't peace. From upstairs came a soft thump, Thomas, stirring. Elias met Mary's eyes, the weight of it settling between them. The guests had come empty-handed, left without memories, and now the house turned on its own. The springs beneath hungered, and the night stretched long. They had to reach the hill before dawn, dig into the source, or lose everything, the farm, their brother, themselves. Elias picked up the journal, its pages singed at the corner. "We end this," he said, voice firmer than he felt. Mary nodded, her caution yielding to resolve. Together, they climbed the stairs, the storm raging as if the land itself protested. Elias Brimstone wiped the sweat from his brow, the lantern's flicker casting jagged shadows across the root cellar's damp walls. The air hung thick with the scent of earth and something sharper, like singed cloth. Upstairs, the house creaked under the weight of the storm, rain lashing the windows like accusations. He glanced at his sister, Clara, her face pale but set, the locket clutched in her fist as if it could ward off the unraveling night. "We can't wait any longer," Clara whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She knelt beside the trapdoor, fingers tracing the iron latch. "The guests, they're stirring." "I heard footsteps in the hall again." Elias nodded, his jaw tight. Brave as he was, the weight of what they'd done pressed on him. The elixir they'd slipped into the wine, the chance borrowed from their mother's old grimoire. It was meant to bind the family secrets, to erase the outsiders' prying eyes from the truth of the Brimstone land. But the ritual had twisted, pulling memories not just from the guests but from the edges of their own minds. Now fragments slipped away, faces of childhood, the shape of their father's grave. He pried the latch open with a rusted crowbar, the hinges groaning like a dying breath. Cool air rushed up, carrying the faint echo of dripping water from the cavern below. "The tunnel leads to the river," he said, more to himself than her. "If we get them there before dawn, the current will take the rest." No traces. Clara's eyes met his, witty spark dimmed by exhaustion. "And if the forgetting claims us first? What then, brother? Do we wash away too?" Before he could answer, a thud echoed from above, furniture scraping, then a muffled cry. One of the guests, Mr. Hargrove, the inquisitive lawyer from Louisville, pounding on the locked parlor door. His voice filtered through the floorboards, slurred and distant. Where are the others?" "The fire," it spoke. Elias froze, heart hammering. The fire? That's where it had started, the hearth flames twisting into shapes that whispered forgotten sins. They'd doused it too late. Now the guests wandered the house like ghosts, piecing together shards of what they'd seen, the hidden altar in the attic, the jars of preserved curiosities that weren't quite animal. "Move," Clara urged, shoving him toward the ladder. She went first, descending into the black maw, her skirt snagging on a root that seemed to curl like a finger. Elias followed, the lantern swinging wild, illuminating veins of quartz in the rock that gleamed like exposed nerves. The tunnel narrowed quickly, forcing them to crouch, shoulders brushing the slick walls. Water seeped from cracks, pooling at their feet, cold enough to numb. Clara led, her caution a quiet guide. She paused at every fork, listening for the river's murmur. But the dread crept in with the damp, whispers now, not from the guests, but from the earth itself. Elias shook his head, blaming the chill, but the voices persisted, naming names he almost recognized, kin long buried, debts unpaid. A low rumble vibrated through the stone, dust sifting down like ash. Clara halted, pressing a hand to the wall. "The land's waking. We disturbed it." Elias gripped the crowbar tighter. "Keep going. The guests won't stay down forever." They pressed on, the tunnel twisting downward, the air growing heavier, laced with the metallic tang of the river. Behind them, faint at first, came the scrape of boots. Hargrove, or perhaps the widow Ellis, their memories fraying but instincts sharp. Elias turned the lantern low, plunging them into near dark, only the glint of water ahead. Clara stumbled, catching herself on a jutting rock. Her locket slipped open, the tiny portrait inside blurred, as if the ink were bleeding away. "Elias." "I can't remember Mother's face." He pulled her up, ignoring the ache in his chest. The river's roar grew louder, a promise of escape, but laced with threat, the current swift, unforgiving, ready to swallow more than secrets. As they rounded the final bend, the cavern opened to a foaming mouth, the water black under the storm's fury. Shadows moved on the bank. The guests, 3 silhouettes against the lightning, eyes hollow, hands outstretched as if beckoning them into the depths. Elias raised the lantern high, the light catching Hargrove's face, twisted in confusion, mouth forming words that dissolved into mist. "Into the water," Clara said, voice breaking. "It's the only way to end it." But as Elias stepped forward, the ground shuddered, cracks spiderwebbing the stone. The land remembered, and it hungered. The lantern's flame flickered low in the Brimstone parlor, casting elongated shadows that clawed at the walls like forgotten sins. Elias Brimstone sat rigid in his high-backed chair, his knuckles white around the armrests, while his sister Clara paced the threadbare rug, her skirts whispering against the floorboards. Outside, the Kentucky night pressed heavy, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, brimstone, always brimstone, lingering like a promise unkept. The last of their guests, the weary traveler from Lexington who'd arrived just 2 dawns ago, slumped in the corner settee, his eyes glassy, mouth slack as if mid-sentence. Elias wiped sweat from his brow, the room's heat unnatural despite the autumn chill seeping through the cracks. "We can't let this one go the way of the others," he muttered, his voice a gravelly thread. Clara stopped pacing, her sharp features twisting in the dim light. She'd always been the cautious one, the keeper of the family's shadowed ledgers, but tonight her hands trembled as she clutched the small vial of murky liquid, their last resort, distilled from the spring behind the old chapel ruins. The traveler stirred faintly, murmuring fragments of names that weren't his own. Elias had seen it before, the way the house fed on memories, unraveling them thread by thread until only husks remained. Their parents had called it a gift, a way to bind wanderers to the land, to keep the Brimstone name alive in whispers. But Elias knew better now. It was a curse, etched into the very timbers of the homestead, demanding tribute with every stranger who crossed the threshold. Clara knelt beside the man, her breath steadying as she uncorked the vial. The liquid gleamed like oil on water, catching the lantern's glow in iridescent swirls. "This'll anchor him," she said, more to herself than Elias. "Pull him back before the house takes the rest." She tilted his head gently, pouring a careful measure past his lips. He coughed, eyes fluttering, but didn't wake. The air hummed then, a low vibration that rattled the glass panes, as if the walls themselves disapproved. Elias rose, crossing to the window where the moon hung bloated over the tobacco fields. He'd buried 2 guests already this season, their empty-eyed forms vanishing into the woods like smoke, leaving only echoes in the family's uneasy sleep. The rival surveyors from town had come sniffing too close last spring, mapping the property lines that hid the spring secret. They'd left without memories, yes, but their absence had drawn questions, sheriff's men, whispers of disappearances. The Brimstones couldn't afford another. A groan pulled him back. The traveler sat up, blinking into the light, his face paling as fragments returned. "The road. I was heading to Louisville." His voice cracked, hands fumbling at his coat, as if searching for something lost. Clara exchanged a glance with Elias, relief warring with dread in her eyes. It had worked, this time, the elixir binding just enough to sever the house's grip without erasing him entirely. But as the man gathered his bearings, a shadow shifted in the corner of Elias's vision. The parlor door, ajar, revealed the hallway stretching into darkness, where faint outlines of previous guests lingered like fog, shapes that shouldn't be, memories the house refused to release. Clara saw it too, her hand flying to her mouth. The traveler stood, unsteady, and for a moment, hope flickered. Then his gaze locked on the shadows, recognition dawning in horror. "No," he whispered, backing toward the door. You're not real." But they were, in a way, echoes clinging to the Brimstone's bloodline, hungry for more. Elias stepped forward, brave facade cracking. "Go now," he urged, voice low, "before it pulls you under again." Clara nodded, pressing a worn map into the man's hands, her witty edge dulled by exhaustion. "Follow the creek north. Don't look back." The traveler bolted into the night, his footsteps crunching on gravel until silence swallowed them. Elias barred the door, the wood groaning under his weight. Clara sank into a chair, the vial empty now, its power spent. The house settled, the hum fading, but the shadows in the hall thickened, curling closer. They'd saved one, adapted their old ritual with the last of the spring's essence, but the cost lingered. the family's own memories fraying at the edges, names and faces blurring in their dreams. Outside, a distant horse whinnied, carrying the guest away. Inside, the Brimstones sat in the dying light, the weight of their inheritance heavier than ever, knowing the house would hunger again come morning.